Thanks, everybody. It was so nice to have so many people I could give a hug to in this crowd. It's like a reunion almost in a lot of ways. And thank you to Kathy and Victoria for making this symposium happen. It took a lot of effort and coordination. As usual, the disclosure section, I don't think we're doing CMEs, but we should probably still have our biases out in the open here. So as you, or many of you are involved in, UVM receives a fair amount of funding from a variety of entities, both government and corporate, for some of the work you're about to see. I and other members of the team have Apple stock, since Apple is one of the sponsors for the study, but I have no personal financial relationships. I think most important is that I'm really speaking on behalf of dozens of people, many of whom are in this room right now, and so I really think it's a recognition of how large a team it takes and how diverse a team it takes to make mobile health technology work. I happen to be the person who was crazy enough to think we could do MiPACT, but then along the way found other crazy people and made a bunch of people crazy, and in the end we're able to deliver this project. And we'll talk about some lessons learned in it. Fundamentally, I think Srijan's addressed this as well, Kathy's gone through this, there's so much into a participant's daily experience. And what we're constantly trying to do is get different data sources that help us understand that unique aspect of that daily experience. Internal health study, other studies, Michigan Genomics Initiatives taught us the importance of the DNA sample. We obviously have electronic health records to tell us their interactions with the health system itself, but the role of the wearables is obviously very important, and this group is key there. We continue to struggle with understanding their social interactions. That's why some of the work that you've seen already today is so exciting, because that might be a little bit of a window into what their life is like from an interaction perspective. How many people are they seeing in the day? Are they leaving their house? Things that involve their social exposures are really remain underexplored, and digital data could be helpful for that. The other concept is that life is not linear. As some of Srijan's graphs showed, recovery from an event, recovery towards, progressing towards something is not a constant pathway. It's not a moment in time. You have good days and you have bad days. And we do these things called ecological momentary assessments. Fancy words for we're going to bug you a lot. And we try and get patient-centered, but it's about bothering them very often. And I do that in my studies. I do it all the time. We're asking patients on postoperative day 0, postoperative day 1, postoperative day 2, the exact same survey. And the question is, can we use these devices to help maybe decrease our participant burden as we see this non-linear progression? Because we know different people start out at different places, and as they progress, they vary in how quickly they get to that end point. For MiPACT, one of the goals is to really understand how we can get a broader view of health and wellness, combining Apple Watch sensor data along with blood pressure monitoring, some NIH promise measures and baseline data that's using standardized survey tools out there, using genetic information potentially to also understand aspects of that, as was shown earlier. There's concepts where these genetic data can inform our understanding of these trajectories of health. It was a 3-year longitudinal study. We just had the final group graduate in January of this year of the initial cohort, and so now the data are actually starting to get more well curated and available. And the sponsors were, there were some U of M departmental, institutional resources, but Apple as well. Many of you helped make this happen, so I won't necessarily belabor a lot of this, but in phase 1, what a participant did was a 45-day period where they wore their Apple Watch at least 12 hours a day. They had some baseline surveys. They took 2 ambulatory home blood pressures per day, which is really intensive from a cardiovascular health and understanding perspective. Give us a blood sample where we did a bunch of standardized labs, cholesterol, lipid panel, chemistry panel, hemoglobin A1C. And then we also sent that off for genotyping as well. They got to maintain ownership of a watch as part of a study device. They received financial benefit from filling out their surveys. And then in phase 2, they would actually go through and wear the watch, continue wearing the watch, and just take blood pressures a little bit less often, but for a much longer time period. There are many MiPACT participants in this crowd. Thank you for participating in MiPACT as well, and for the data you've provided to us. The initial MiPACT cohort was an in-person cohort. We enrolled nearly 7,000 patients over just 16 months. It was unbelievable operational activity. We'll get into a bit. And then this weird thing called COVID happened, and we wanted to enroll an additional set of participants, and so we did a complete transition to completely online and remote enrollment. And that was a very educational experience for us, and something that I think many folks here are doing now, but we'll give you some lessons learned from that as well. So the in-person piece was just a massive outreach effort. We have a very forward-thinking IRB, and some of the representatives are here today. Our IRB is willing to have you email patients. There's many IRBs I talk to across the country that don't let you even email a participant to let them know about a study. So we emailed patients, we did phone calls, we put out flyers, we had community events to get to communities that were underrepresented in research. It was a lot of work and a massive team that was out there pressing the flesh, making those connections happen. Those multiple channels did work. The logistics of managing and distributing 7,000 devices, as you can imagine, was nearly like a warehouse-like activity. It was Amazon-like at our offices for a bit. We took advantage of an amazing infrastructure we have at U of M called the CTSA and the M crew itself. A wonderful staff. They're helping out with blood sampling. When there's a patient with a really high blood pressure, having a clinician around to help out with that. So a lot of folks helping. And we were at one point enrolling 200 patients per week through MCrew, through a couple different locations of MCrew, which was an impressive logistics task. During the COVID pandemic, we had to figure out how to do a lot of this in a digital format. And so we did learn some things there, which is you really have to test a participant's ability to work with technology before you fully invest in a bi-directional relationship there. And it's not testing them, it's testing our ability to work with them. So it goes both ways. Do we have the ability, do we have the staff that can actually communicate certain concepts completely remotely? So we had a wonderful team that said, okay, how do we take our manual of procedures and make it completely digital? How do we make sure that we're not wasting people's time, but how do we also potentially ensure we've got similar study compliance? So we had one visit that we kind of had that initial interaction. A study consent was performed. We wanted to make sure they understood the protocol, what was necessary to be considered a full-fledged participant. They'd download the study apps, and if all of that went well, which it almost always did, but it was a process to really gain a shared understanding with the participant, we would then ship them the devices, and then up to 2 weeks later, we would have a second interaction with them where we actually did the device configuration. It was amazing how tech savvy many participants are, and it was amazing how they didn't necessarily fit our incoming biases of what age groups and education levels are those digitally savvy individuals. A lot of times people have the devices largely set up when we picked up the phone and called them for their second visit. We did require a second device so that we could actually video Zoom with them, and that gave us the ability to really connect with that participant. One of the key things when you're enrolling a participant is, do they have a connection with the study goals, beyond the compensation, beyond understanding the basic broad ideas? Do they feel like they're part of a community? Because if they're part of a community, they feel an obligation to the community. The same way we have an obligation to them. It's amazing. A participant gets an obligation to the study. And so that video requirement, although it did create some, I think, limitations in who could participate, who's got a second device is potentially different than who doesn't have a second device. I think it was really important to create that personal connection and maintain that personal connection that we had with the in-person interactions, which then as a result, as you'll see in a moment, had pretty similar results from a compliance perspective. The informed consent process was using an app that we've seen other folks here mention, My Data Helps. There was no paper consent. This concept is actually something we're still learning. A lot of IRBs around the country are getting comfortable with. They have a e-consent they accept, not multiple e-consent. So once again, we have a relatively forward-thinking group here where they accept, if it's a parts CFR Part 11, there's some numbers in there I'm forgetting, compliant consent module, they'll accept it. Many IRBs require you to go through and use the only one they support. But we used this app. This app included the blood pressure connections, had compliance reminders, and did EHR integration, which is important. We'll talk about that in a moment as well. One thing that I really strongly recommend that we incorporate into mobile health technologies more explicitly is assessment of understanding in our consenting process. It's surprising to me that this remains a non-required part of consenting in general. It's surprising to me that this is considered novel in many areas, and it's surprising to me that we don't make this universal, particularly when it comes to digital technology, particularly when it comes to privacy. Your participant really needs to know what they're signing up for. And that isn't them signing the consent at the bottom. That's them actually being asked meaningful questions, having a dialogue, making mistakes in their understanding, and then having a conversation with the research coordinator really get all the way there. And so as we think about what the standards of a mobile health study at the University of Michigan or led by U of M is like, we've essentially incorporated this into all of our work. I no longer enroll participants unless there's an assessment of understanding as part of our project. We've got a clinical trial we're running now. We have an assessment of understanding there, not because we were required to, because it's the right thing to do. So I think one thing our community here could come up with is what is a reasonable set of assessment of understanding for a digital mediated study. When we compared the in-person and virtual experiences, it was actually really encouraging how well it worked out. It was a pleasant surprise to us, I'll be honest. We didn't know how it would work out, but we, as you see here, pretty similar in terms of folks that completed the basic requirements in that phase 1, 98%, pretty similar there. We actually had a lower withdrawal rate in the virtual group, I think potentially because of that first visit. That first visit established an understanding and established almost an energy of activation for you chemistry majors to actually understand, like, is this participant and is this research coordinator able to have that relationship? And as a result, you didn't have interactions a month later that didn't meet that threshold of ability. We did have a lot of folks, when they're not driving in, they'll say, oh, I forgot about the appointment. Can we just reschedule to tomorrow? So the remote visit was logistically a bit more challenging, required us to have many more capacity opportunities for enrollment because people would forget, their device wouldn't be working that day, they had bad Wi-Fi, things would happen. When you have an appointment and you're supposed to be there, it's different when you have to drive somewhere. It's a different part of your schedule. And so you saw that different rescheduled appointment right there. What that also did for us in that time period was really highlight a shift in data control. Historically, we as researchers have felt we are taking data from the participants and now it is our data. That is the wrong way to think about it, as many people in this room have taught me. But what's really happening is it's no longer the health system's data either anymore. It's the participants' data. So there's something that many people in this room know called FHIR. It's a standard for how data can flow between electronic health records. Implementation of FHIR is required by the 21st Century Cures Act, and there's very severe penalties for what's called information blocking. It's why you have a MyChart patient portal now. And it's why pretty much every health system is required to have a MyChart patient portal that includes laboratory values, your discharge diagnoses, what medications you're on, what procedures you've had done. So these days, instead of having this model where you deal with people like me, associate deans of stuff, and try and get data use agreements and all that stuff, we need to actually be interacting with the participants, because our participant controls the data, and rather than dealing with CIOs and deans and legal officers, you interact with the participant, which is actually an important skill to have. If you're building trust with the participant, to get their EHR data to you, that's the same trust and relationship you need to have with quote-unquote study compliance. So it causes you to do things we need to be doing anyway. This shift in data control is really important, and I think it's underappreciated in a lot of our studies. We still think of health systems as the locus of control and health systems as the way we're going to get trials to happen and digital engagement to happen. But as many folks in this room have shown, there's national studies out there. You know, you move the control from health systems to actually participants and go directly to them. The pandemic had many, many, many bad things. There was a couple positives that have come out of it. And the virtualization of healthcare, it's amazing how everybody knows their patient portal password now. I think it's up to like 80% now. My parents, who are in an age group that you'd be biased against and think they wouldn't be able to join a video call, they join video calls. They have a portal, and they can share their data with whatever research study they think makes sense. The way it works is that you have a study. It can be a study app. It can be within an app ecosystem. That research app, just like who here has an Amazon Alexa at home? Come on, admit it, it's okay. Who here has Spotify? Yeah. And now you've got Spotify on Alexa sometimes. That handshake that occurs between those two platforms is the exact same handshake that can happen between a patient's portal and your mobile device to allow sharing of EHR data. It's not that data is going directly from one to the other, it's being shared between them. So a participant goes to their study device and has a research app, which is FHIR compliant, can connect to their portal for their healthcare provider. That study app sends them to their MyChart, their Epic, or otherwise patient portal. They preview, essentially the portal screens to say, do you give permission? They go ahead and confirm, I give you permission for this type of data, that type of data, and then the control goes back to the study app itself. That interaction Has a little bit of a technical understanding requirement from the participant perspective, but you can give them a how-to and they can handle it pretty well. More importantly, it creates a lot of transparency for the participant. When you get a HIPAA authorization and a standard IRB consent, patients really don't know what they're sending over there. And sometimes they file a complaint a year or two later to say, wait, how did you know that about me? I think anybody who's enrolled, lots of patients has had those complaints. And it's not, a flippant thing to just ignore those. It just shows how little understanding our research participants often have. Well, when they're actually sharing the data this way, this looks familiar to many of you. This is your EPIC MyTRIC portal. This is the type of stuff they can choose to share, and they know this is what is being shared now. Once again, that engagement is really important for an engaged community that gets you other things you need going down through the study itself. So some of the other lessons we've learned. There was a major focus on diverse enrollment for this study, and we had lots of concerns about whether or not we'd be able to deliver a diverse population, knowing that Michigan itself lacks diversity compared to the University of Michigan lacks diversity compared to the state of Michigan. State of Michigan in some ways lacks diversity compared to the US, so how do we address that? And it just took a lot of work, building a lot of trust, and we were able to address it. We had 18% of our patients were over age 65, so a lot of those biases about who can have an Apple Watch, who can follow blood pressure, and learn how to do it. It took a lot of amazing research coordinators explaining the word Bluetooth over and over again. And just an absolute testament to the patience of our team members and to the patience to the participants as well. As you see here, we were actually able to achieve a Hispanic, non-Hispanic ratio that far exceeds what University of Michigan Health actually has. And that's because we oversampled, over-approached certain populations. And that took a fair amount of work, but it's possible. And the concepts that digital studies have to cause a digital divide, I think we have to start dispelling that. Digital studies may, without additional focus and effort, cause a digital divide, but they don't have to. We have to put additional resources in to keep them there. Amazing work by a couple authors in this room right now. This is a paper in Lancet Digital Health, and we actually showed what we learned from this participant group in terms of consent rates and their actual digital biomarkers from the perspective of resting heart rate, blood pressures, stratified by their actual conditions. So historically, if you try to do a clinical trial on, we think with this trial we will increase step count by 200 steps. We've heard those phrases. Well, what's the baseline? Are you adequately powered to do that? What about patients with atrial fibrillation that are over age 65 and obese? What's their daily step count? These fundamental concepts are necessary in your adequately powering study, and most digital studies didn't historically have the data to be adequately powered. So we built a website, researchtools.mipactstudy.org. You can go to it and actually put in a couple of criteria and understand what a patient's baseline step count is, heart rates, what their blood pressures are. So as you try and actually model your clinical trial, you have some actual foundational data to build that upon. And this is just a quick snapshot of what that website looks like. Other things that we learned is that, as you know, there were mood and stress changes during the pandemic, and just like certain election events affected people, there is some association here. This is a paper that we're working on right now. So right when the pandemic, quote unquote, started in Michigan, you saw immediately a change in self-reported mood, and immediately you saw an increase in self-reported stress on the right side that you see there. There were some differences by age group in those concepts. The effect was the association was the same, but the baseline place where each of them was starting was a little bit different. And as expected, there were differences in activity. So this is, there's a lot of papers out there considering changes in step count and things like that. Oftentimes they don't have that longitudinal view. They've only got a 1 or 2 week snapshot here. This is a really nice project because we actually have baseline data prior to the pandemic and then follow-on data as well. So as you see on the left side, average daily step counts associated with the pandemic, right around there, as you see. All groups saw a decrease in step count based upon age. And this is a signal that we're trying to understand more and really get to see what the p-values are like and if it's an effect size that's real. But we actually saw differences by race in terms of the step count changes. And it's potentially some disparities in how the pandemic affected different races in terms of not just their health outcomes, which we definitely know, but potentially their daily life and living and things as simple as how much they were walking. This is all, once again, data that MiPACT happened to be collecting when you're building a longitudinal cohort of digital data. We had some tough decisions to make, and people in this room helped us make those, but we had to think about, what is that device? Is that device compensation? Is that device a study device? And having honest discussions about that. And saying, you can't be a part of this project if you don't have that device. It's not compensation. People may perceive it that way, but the reality is it's a study device, and that has certain implications for the participant. Do we reuse devices or not? We thought about that. We've thought about that for a couple other projects. At this point, the cost of a Fitbit and the cost of shipping that Fitbit back after a study and then cleaning it and logistics, it's just not worth reusing devices, even though funders sometimes ask you to do that. And having a kind of a shared blurb for your cost budget justification would be really helpful. And then certainly equity considerations of people who have a device already, the BYOD model versus a device distribution model. We had conversations around inducement versus compensation, and there are now guidance from PCORI on dollars per hour of time spent and things like that, so we can feel more comfortable with that. And then I think one of the really important ones that we were constantly doing is when you're actually asking participants for data, you really have to think about, do I have a rigorous scientific hypothesis? Is it plausible I'll have one a year or two from now? Or am I just being curious as an investigator? And we have to keep assessing that, because every additional thing you ask of that participant, you have to make sure you can convince yourself, and more importantly them, that there might be some science behind it, as opposed to just our tendency to collect as much as we want. And I'm the guy who likes to collect as much data as possible, and so we had to have those conversations for something as simple as, we'll talk about in a moment, geolocation. We had some things we learned when it comes to equity related to perceptions that platform choice makes a big difference. As the previous data showed, you can still achieve a representative cohort. There might still be some equity issues underlying here, but oversampling can address some of those. We had stratified enrollment, and we actually had to tell some people, no, we can't enroll you based upon your the stratum that you're in, and having a study group, a ethics board, and a sponsor that agreed with that was really important. It was tough. To tell people, no, we can't enroll you, but tell the person sitting next to them, yes, we can enroll you. That's a tough conversation to have, and sometimes those are the conversations we need to have to get to representative samples. We talk about the scientific curiosity. I've got projects where we collect geolocation data. People in this room are running projects where you have geolocation data, and you should collect it if you have a hypothesis that needs geolocation data. Otherwise, we used to have investigators, and we still do to this day, that say, oh, if you can collect geolocation, they would just check that box in the platform. That's massive privacy risk, as you can imagine, and it really doesn't build the trust necessarily unless you can explain to the participant, here's why we need your geolocation data, here's what we're going to do with it, and here's what we're not going to do with it. So I think as we're considering the many different data types we can collect, really need to be thoughtful about being able to communicate the value of each of those data types, and arming our research coordinators to have those conversations effectively. One of the most fulfilling parts of the whole project, I'll be honest, was just the return of results work. We felt we had a commitment to doing return of results. That's how you build a community. That's what we've been told. It actually works. NIH, all of us, had these concepts built in. And so we had built out a study portal, we being people in this room, built out a really cool study portal that participants could log in. They could get to it from their phone. They could get to it from a website. And some of the things that were in that website, in that portal, and that we used to push to them, this is my blood pressure data from year 2 of the study. We would give them an easy to understand pie chart, which is just one of the best visualizations out there. All the data science people in here are dying right now when I use a pie chart. But we had meaningful conversations with cardiologists, primary care doctors. How do you say what this is? I mean, the number of meetings we had and the number of people in this room who helped us say, what do you do with this data? This is my data. Because of this data, I lost some weight, and I actually changed how much coffee I drank, and now my blood pressure data looks completely different than this because I got that back. It was my own study, for crying out loud, something as simple as your blood pressure data. And this is one of the most important things, to create a community with your participants. You give them this, and then they might give you things back. People are reasonable if they see value in what they're giving to you. With the genetic testing, surprise, I'm Indian, as it turns out. And so we gave some ancestry data back. And what we learned here was there's an entire industry out there on ancestry data, right? We had a ton of dissatisfied participants because our ancestry data was so much less granular than what they got from 23andMe and Ancestry.com. So as academics, we have to know that what we can deliver is being benchmarked by the participants with the rest of the world. We know that, particularly when you're dealing with a mobile device, but when you do return of results, they have a standard of care that is not defined by us. And so we have to be thoughtful about what we define. So this is something we thought we were giving them, that we thought would be a delighter. It really wasn't in the end, because the standard of care around us was so much more advanced. And we had monthly and quarterly newsletters where we really felt responsible to help them understand what we're doing with the data, what's going on, other resources. Hey, update your device. There's a security breach on your iOS. So we had a monthly newsletter that took a lot of time to curate. And in modern times, so a couple years down now, we actually have a patient panel that guides us on this thing from one of my new studies. So one thing I learned from MiPACT was we need to have an active patient panel that actually guides you on a lot of these choices, which is not something we did a great job of necessarily back then. And then finally, this room is necessary. A community of researchers is essential, both for the technical infrastructure and for the implementation core. So it's not just about infrastructure, it's also implementation. These concepts of privacy and security, language that should be used in a consent, language that should be used in pamphlets. It does not need to be recreated every single time. The app, every faculty loves to have an app named after them. Having the humility to not have like my favorite acronym is actually really important. And so I think that the concept of having a shared app, whatever that app might be, across investigators, across projects is really important if it has a good configurable engine. And some of the great work that's being done with Eisenberg on the data flows, having data pipelines, and that's just really underappreciated work that can stop you from doing great science. Logistics, as we talked about, is really important. For our current trial now, we've got a 12,500 patient trial, randomized clinical trial. We're just using the device logistics that Fitbit offers. Be able to hit a button, embedded into the app. We're not shipping devices anymore, and that's an important consideration. Devices are great, but the logistics can be really challenging. As we talked about, patient-reported outcome and consent libraries, really best practices, how to go live, how to train your coordinators. Those return of result templates could be really nice, so people aren't having to figure out every single word of the return of result stuff on their own. And then every time I'm trying to decide what device to use, I call up Kathy, and she tells me, use this device. And then we do it. And that expertise that she can give you in one email, and Srijan offers in another email, that is really, really valuable stuff that this room could really benefit from, and our patients, most importantly. So with that, a couple key takeaways. Diverse enrollment is possible. It takes work. Remote enrollment is not just possible. It might actually have some advantages compared to in-person enrollment in some ways. And we can use wearable data and wearable data cohorts to actually power clinical trial analyses more effectively. Getting the participant in control of the data will actually get you more data if you give them return results and you help them understand what they're getting out of it. And a room like this and a digital room like this is really necessary. Thank you so much for your time. Questions now? Questions now? Any questions or inaccuracies, since most of the people who built this are in the room right now?
Do we have any? We have a question back here. And Sachin, if you could repeat the question so that it's picked up on the video.
Great.
Yeah, thanks for the great presentation. I had sort of two questions about the return of data to the participants, and sort of at what level or what concerns does the IRB have in terms of how you're telling people to interpret their own data, because it's very easy just to say, right, here's your data, do what you want with it, and I think that's a low hurdle, much higher hurdle to say this is what your data means, particularly if you're looking at factors that we're trying to understand what that means. So that's sort of the first question, and then the second question builds on that of at what level of sort of participant number in your study would you feel comfortable sharing sort of the group-wide norms? You may be looking at, right, MiPACT is huge, you may be looking at smaller numbers of 1,000 or 500 or 200 or 100.
Great question. So the first question was IRB and ethical implication of return of results and interpretation. In our experience with the U of M IRB, the IRB was less focused on the return of results data than I think other organizations might be. We really felt that that's not an IRB responsibility, so we had a DSMB, and there's people in this room which were on that DSMB. We had a DSMB, a Data Safety Monitoring Board, for an observational study. I'd never heard of that. I think it was Brahmaji's idea, genius. He's like, make it somebody else's fault if something's wrong. And fundamentally, you want a disinterested party, right? What we're talking about is how do we separate the biases and interests and incentives of a study PI from the participant's interests. And IRB is one form of that, but fundamentally when you do a clinical trial, a DSMB guides you on those choices. So we did DSMB, and that DSMB guided us on what to put in there, what to not put in there, and then the DSMB would oftentimes defer to clinical experts. So we brought clinical experts that weren't on the DSMB. We talked to primary care doctors, so as you can imagine, we were actually recruiting a lot of primary care clinics. So we asked a couple of we had co-investigators on our study that were just rank and file 100% clinicians. And I had no idea, but apparently giving respected clinicians effort on a trial, on a study is a novel thing. So we took their time, so we gave them 5 or 10% effort, and they answered our emails when we did that. And they said, don't use that word, because then I'll have to explain that word. Use this word instead. So we really felt like it was our study team responsibility to create infrastructure for return of results, but then go to a disinterested set of parties like a DSMB, and then go to experts who would deal with the return of results we may be doing to define how we do it well. So I would say, don't think that because we can do science well, we can do return of results well. The main mistake I made was not having a active patient partner panel involved in it. And that was, I think, 5 years ago, that was a reasonable thing. I think in 2023, 2024, you just got to have patient partner panels. Whether or not your funder's making you do it, you just got to, because you'll do better work. And a lot of those tough decisions that we were like wringing our hands over, you just have more comfort. The second question was around sample size. So if you go to researchtools.org, we actually have a cell size limitation of 10. We picked that number right. It might be 20 or 25. Jeremy, what's the cell size? Okay, we don't remember. It's 10, okay. And we picked, what H cup and everybody else does, cell size less than 10. So for some reason we felt comfortable with that. I'm sure there's a statistician in here right now dying as I said that. I apologize. There's probably a much more thoughtful way to define it, but we a lot of times you just have to go with prior art, so we picked 10, despite it, because you could do it. You could do AFib, over 60 years old, Asian with heart failure, 4 people. Sorry, can't give that to you. Great question.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I really love the idea of having an assessment of understanding as part of the onboarding process. Would you be able to unpack for us the practical and scientific considerations that went into your team's thought process of thinking through what specific items would be really great to include in an assessment of understanding in that onboarding process? Thank you.
Great question. I will give you the practical because I don't think there are any scientific ones. I think the assessment of understanding literature remains pretty immature. I, as a researcher, haven't been exposed to it well. I think it's an area of further research. Our practical considerations were, and we do this for all of our studies, what is the part that we're kind of, everybody doing work, you always have that time when you have that little knot in your stomach when you're making a decision, right? So anything that resulted in a knot in our stomach was an assessment of understanding question. And everything that we said, this is something that if they don't get this right, they might be really upset afterward. Duration of study, compensation, types of data coming out, risks. The IRB is helpful for that. So once you start doing assessment of understanding questions, the IRB analysts were, and that's the other thing. Am I allowed to say who our IRB analyst was? Our IRB analyst is here for MiPACT. She was spectacular. You just need, and I don't think people here necessarily appreciate, your IRB analyst can be your partner to enable your study. They are not a gatekeeper. They are not an obstacle. They take the best practices that they're learning from the 10 other studies that are trying to do the same thing you are. They give you the benchmarking. They create a community in their brain. And so we actually worked with our IRB analysts to actually help out and say what makes sense in here. I would love to see, and it may be there, and this is my ignorance, if there's good science for digital health studies and appropriate assessment of understanding. I don't think there is probably. I think that's something we could probably do in our room right now. But I think the focus would be, tough decisions, and anything that involves types of data flows. I think that's the part that people still don't understand. How do you take a consent, which, to be blunt, to this day remains an end user license agreement, right? Let's be honest, we still have an end user license agreement. We call it a consent. How do you make that more effective? We worked with our IRB to allow us to do summaries. So in our app, there was a summary page with a graphic that explained the overall concept, and then there was the detail. So we were adhering to OHRP requirements for an end user license agreement, but we worked with the IRB to really create a reasonable set of questions that were easy to understand. So our main practical considerations were those knots in your stomach and objective things that, including risk. But I would love to get other people's thoughts on that and other experiences there. All right, thanks everybody.